Nobody told them humans had built the chair before they built the weapon. The vote was 411 to 37. Roisin Achterberg dipped her glass nib pen into the inkwell, waited 3 seconds for the pool to settle and the nib split, and recorded it. Not the outcome, the tally, exact, and hurried. The strokes of each numeral pressed into the page with the same pressure she used every other evening aboard the still hearth, when the corridor lights dimmed to half and the rest of the diplomatic staff had gone to their bunks. 411. A pause. 37. The scratch of glass on paper was the only sound in the observation gallery's secondary tier. Around her, 6 other diplomatic aides had gone rigid in the particular way that people go rigid when something structural and irreversible has just been decided about them. One of them had her hand pressed over her mouth. Another had simply sat down on the floor, which was not a chair. Because all the chairs were at the primary observation railing, he had not made it back to one. Roy's, and finished the entry. She capped the pen. Outside, through the curved U-port behind her, the Dracvel-Seidel conclave's orbital ring rotated in slow amber silence, lit from its own internal systems, its geometry unchanged by what had been decided inside it. 411 votes. 37 dissents. The orbital ring did not know. The orbital ring would not know. That was the nature of infrastructure. It continued regardless. Selshkorova N had been seated in the HFY observation bay on the conclave's diplomatic tier when the final count was read. He was 88 years old, which in HFY terms meant he was in what his species considered early middle service, old enough to have seen catastrophic votes before, young enough that his documentation reflexes still moved faster than his emotional processing. His stylus was in his hand before the chamber speaker had finished announcing the tally. This was not composure. This was training so deep it had become biological. He wrote the tally. He wrote the chamber temperature at time of vote 19.4 degrees, slightly cooler than standard, because the Drac VL ran cold and the conclave's environmental systems defaulted to whichever species held the chair. He wrote the names of the 37 who had dissented, because in HFY diplomatic tradition the minority was always named first. They were the ones history would eventually need to locate when the record was used for something other than commemoration. Then he left 2 full lines blank. In 88 years of filed reports, across 14 diplomatic postings on 11 different stations, he had never done that. What he did not write, what his stylus hovered above and then withdrew from, was the detail that had settled in him like sediment settling in still water. Slow and irreversible. Roisin Achterberg had not moved, not when the tally was announced. Not when the aide to her left made a sound in his throat that was not quite a word. Not when the conclave speaker waited the customary 30 seconds for formal objection and received none. She had simply, with the particular economy of someone performing a routine act, reached into the leather writing case on the rail beside her, produced the glass nib pen, uncapped it, and begun to write. Selshkorova N had been watching human diplomatic personnel for 4 years. He had developed what he considered a reliable taxonomy of their behavioral responses to acute stress. There was the pressed flat hands response, both palms on the nearest solid surface. There was the controlled breath response, chest visibly slowing while the face attempted neutrality. There was the displacement activity response, in which the hands found something small and irrelevant to do, adjusting a collar, recapping a stylus already capped while the mind processed what the body could not yet absorb. What Roisin was doing looked like displacement activity. The pen moving, the hand occupied, the self retreating inward to a place where 411 votes could not immediately follow. She is managing collapse, he wrote. Finally, in the lower margin of the log page, hand settling behavior, consistent with extended service diplomatic personnel under acute existential stress. Monitor for withdrawal indicators over the next 72 hours. He pressed his personal seal into the wax at the letters lower edge, the small, deliberate press, the 8-sided geometric pattern of his family line. The moment in HFY tradition when a document stops being words and becomes a record, and filed it under PRIORTYWACH. He was wrong about everything except the pen. The part that still keeps me up at night is not what they built. It's what they chose not to use it for. 11 minutes after the vote, Caspian Wright found her in the corridor outside the gallery's secondary exit. He was 29 years old, from a family of marine cartographers in Guangzhou who had not entirely understood what he did for a living and had stopped asking after his 3rd overseas posting in 5 years. He had spent 4 of those years as Roisin's primary aide, which had taught him a number of things that no cartographer's family would have found useful at dinner: how to read the specific texture of her silences, how to distinguish between the silence that meant she was processing and the silence that meant she had already finished processing and was now waiting for everyone else to catch up, and how to enter a room she was already in without making the kind of noise that interrupted whichever of those two things was currently happening. This silence, the one in the corridor outside the secondary exit, had been running for 11 minutes. He had timed it from the moment the speaker finished the tally. 3 minutes longer than any he had previously recorded. "They actually did it," he said. Roisin was looking at the corridor wall. Gray composite paneling, standard concave construction, a hairline seam where two sections had been joined at slightly unequal pressure, the kind of impression that only showed under direct light at a specific angle. "Yes, all 411. 411, she said. "And 37 who didn't." Something in the weight she put on 37 made Caspian go quiet. Not the number itself, he had the number. He'd had it for 4 years. It was one of the parameters the doctrine had modeled against. It was the way she said it, as though the 37 mattered more to her at this particular moment than the 411. As though she had already run some calculation using that smaller number that produced a result he hadn't been given access to yet. She turned from the wall. Her face held the expression she wore when reviewing census overlays: attentive, organized. The particular quality of focus that meant everything extraneous had been set aside, only the relevant remained. "Both halves," she said. He understood immediately. The knowing of it arrived below the sternum. Cold and precise. The way certainty feels when it has been anticipated for a long time and finally arrives wearing the exact shape you predicted. "Both," he confirmed. That was it. That was the entirety of the activation. No coded transmission. No written order. No signal sent through any channel that the conclave's monitoring infrastructure could have recorded and flagged. 2 words in a Greek orator. The faint harmonic of the conclave's orbital stabilizers running through the walls at a frequency that was felt more than heard. Caspian turned and walked back toward the still hearth communications suite. Roisin stood in the corridor. Selch-Korova N's surveillance log would later record the duration of that stillness: 13 seconds, measured from the moment Caspian's footsteps became inaudible to the moment her own footsteps resumed. In Hrisvari documentary practice, intervals of that length between a catastrophic event and a subject's first purposeful movement were classified as processing intervals, the gap the mind requires to integrate what the body has already registered. Selch-Korova N filed it under that heading. He categorized it as grief. He was not entirely wrong, but grief was only the outermost layer of what those 13 seconds contained, and it was the thinnest one by a considerable margin. The 2-document doctrine had been founded 12 years before the vote, in a converted cargo prep bay on the lower operational deck of the still hearth, during a planning session that Roisin's filed notes later described as logistically unglamorous and almost certainly a fire hazard. Owing to the number of paper documents spread across surfaces that were not rated for paper documents in a bay that was rated for cargo containers, the principle had been written on a single index card. Glass nib hand, blue-black ink, the letters slightly smaller than her respondent's because she had been using a narrower nib that evening and hadn't adjusted her pressure calibration yet. Build the weapon to end them. Build the chair for them to sit in. Choose the chair. The card was still in the operational file, sleeved in archival plastic. The ink unfaded because she had used the good ink, the kind that lasted 12 years. 2 parallel architectures, running simultaneously, neither one subordinate to the other, both drawing from the same intelligence pool, both staffed by the same small core team who understood that they were building to futures and could only use one. Tom Albuquerque ran the census operation from a converted relay office in a mid-district building in Coimbra that officially belonged to a civilian spatial mapping firm. He was 40 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the particular kind of patience that manifests not as stillness, but as an ability to return to the same data set for the 1400 find in it something the 1399th pass had missed. He had a gift for spatial pattern recognition that made him extraordinarily effective at cross-referencing military infrastructure placement with civilian population distribution, the exact distance between a weapons depot and the nearest residential cluster, the overlap zones where supply chain disruption would cascade into civilian systems, the exclusion corridors that had to be maintained for any operation to remain within the parameters Roisin had set on day one. 9,200 census files, 14 years of quarterly updates. Every military installation mapped against its civilian context, color-coded, maintained in parallel with the charter's population data, which used the same files to locate the residential centers that would need direct representation in the code sign articles. That evening, when the mapping console went dark and the shift officially ended, Tom wheeled his chair 3 meters to the left, to the small upright piano he had positioned against the relay office's inner wall shortly after moving in. He played for between 22 and 40 minutes. He was not a skilled pianist. He had never claimed to be. The instrument had come with the office from the previous tenant, and he had kept it because the alternative was an empty wall. And an empty wall at the end of a 14-hour census mapping shift produced a particular quality of silence that he found actively unpleasant. Selshkorova ends observation log, which at this stage covered 17 months of peripheral behavioral intelligence on the Still Hearth's operational staff gathered through indirect channels, contained the following entry filed under HFY War and und CRITICRIT. Subject Albuquerque. T. Daily post-shift activity documented over 23 sessions. Subject engages in musical performance using small upright percussive keyboard. Portable class. Positioned in southwest quadrant of operational space. Performance quality structurally inconsistent across all sessions. Recurring errors in tempo. T. And on for separate occasions apparent key signature. Subject displays no visible awareness of deviations. Duration of sessions 20 to 40 minutes. Variable. Hypothesis: human stress regulation ritual involving controlled failure as a normalization mechanism. Comparable to HFY practice of deliberate inefficiency in non-critical tasks to preserve cognitive resources for critical ones. No further data available. Observation priority LOW. The phrase controlled failure had taken Selshkorova 40 minutes to arrive at. He had found it, finally, in a HFY behavioral archive cross-referencing human recreational activities, and had filed it with the confidence of a man who believed he had correctly identified the function of something he did not personally understand. He had not. 3 floors above Tom's relay office, which was a figure of speech. Given that Sigrun Valdiestati was in a different city, on a different continent, in a different country, Sigrun had spent 12 years embedded inside the Drak civilian research cover that was, by any standard, extraordinarily well constructed. She was 43 years old, from Akuyeri, and she had the kind of discipline that comes not from suppressing emotion but from having learned, over many years, that the most useful thing emotion can do in a professional context is inform observation without distorting it. She had spent 12 years listening. What she had gathered, across those years, was not primarily weapons-grade intelligence. It was letters, dozens of them, collected through a cultural archive project she had volunteered to manage as cool assignment initiative run to the ministry's education division, in which children from Drak VL residential settlements practiced formal script by writing letters addressed to no one in particular. Most of the letters were about predictable things: food preferences, seasonal weather patterns, a younger sibling's illness, the particular difficulty of a mathematics problem that had resisted solution for 3 weeks, but across 14 separate collection cycles, in 14 slightly different phrasings that were nonetheless recognizably the same sentence. The same fear appeared. We do not want to be the last ones. Sigrun had read that sentence in 14 different children's handwriting before she sat down one evening, set the letters aside, and understood what she was actually looking at. Not a political statement, not propaganda, a species-level terror, written by children who had absorbed it the way children absorb everything, not through argument, but through the quality of the air in rooms where the adults were afraid. The Drak VCL were cold-blooded. Their reproductive cycle was slow by any interstellar comparison. They had been watching a warm-blooded species expand across habitable star systems with a biological velocity they could not match, and they had run their own version of Tome's census maps, and they had arrived at a conclusion they did not know how to share with anyone. Because the conclusion was not a military strategy. It was a fear of being rendered irrelevant by the sheer pace of another species' existence. Sigrun filed the letters under CHA or DSIGNA or TICCCCOREP or YESINTOPEN. Equal Drak VL seats on the council from day one. Not concession. Architecture. The weapons targeting data on the Charter's code sign articles had been built from the same intelligence, in the same 12 years, by people who understood that the information could be used to ways and had decided, before they had it, which way they intended to use it. The third operative had not come home. and Belkacem, 41 years old, from Algiers, had been running a deep cover asset position inside HFY Administrative Center when his cover broke. 6 years ago, the Stillhearth's operational file listed him under DETINRDSTIC, which was the designation used when there was confirmed indication of continued life but no viable extraction pathway that wouldn't cascade into network exposure across multiple other positions. He was alive. The file was updated quarterly. The quarterly updates did not contain additional information, because additional information would have required a contact attempt, and a contact attempt would have required a pathway that did not exist. What none of them knew what the file could not contain, because it had never been transmitted, was what 6 years of HFY's held attention had given him. Inside the facility, Anwar had learned to recognize the specific sound a HFY makes when frightened. It was not a sound designed to be recognized. The HFY did not vocalize distress in the manner of warm-blooded species, no elevated pitch, no volume shift, no intake of breath that a trained ear could identify and flag. What happened instead was a low lateral click from the second jaw, barely audible at conversational distance, produced involuntarily by the autonomic system when it registered a threat it had not anticipated. Most species who interacted with HFY regularly never heard it, because most interactions occurred in professional settings with ambient noise and the appropriate social distance that diplomatic protocol maintained. The click was not loud. It required proximity, stillness, and extended exposure to a single individual to isolate from background. Anwar had all three, for 6 years, in a room that was not large. His primary guard, a mid-rank administrative officer whose full designation Anwar could not hold in his mouth, so he had privately reduced it to a 2-syllable approximation that he never used aloud, made that click with notable consistency whenever a report arrived. Not the major assessments, not the strategic briefings, the routine reports, casualty projections, supply assessments, territorial modeling, the bureaucratic background noise of an ongoing conflict. The click happened in the 2 seconds after the report header was read, before the content. It happened when nobody in the room was supposed to be listening for it. 6 years of that sound. By year 3, Anwar had arrived at the same place. Sigrun's 14 letters had reached from a completely different direction. The HFY had not voted 411 to 37 for human extinction because they despised humanity. They had voted that way because they had done their own version of the mathematics, and the mathematics had produced a conclusion that looked, from inside their fear, like the only viable option. They were not acting from hatred. They were acting from the terror of a species that had watched its own trajectory and found it insufficient, and had reached for the most catastrophic available instrument because the most catastrophic available instrument was the one that addressed the math. The distinction did not make the vote less catastrophic. It made it legible, and legible things, Roisin had written on the index card 12 years ago, could be designed around. Anwar could not send this understanding out. No extraction window, no signal pathway, no method of transmission that the network could carry without cascading exposure. He sat with it in the detention facility for 6 years, turning it in his hands like an object he had been handed with no address to send it to and no instructions for what it was supposed to become. Meanwhile, on the still hearth, Roisin received a letter. It came through the HFY diplomatic courier channel, the only interstellar correspondence system that the Conclave's monitoring infrastructure was, by treaty, prohibited from scanning. The seal on the outer envelope bore the 8-sided geometric impression of Selshkurovian's personal press, which in HFY tradition distinguished private correspondence from official record, indicated that the contents reflected personal concern rather than institutional position. The script inside was archaic HFY court hand subordinate clauses before the main clause, the way HFY had written formal personal letters for 4 centuries, so that the most important thing in each sentence arrived last, weighted by everything that preceded it. Of all the diplomatic actors I have observed across 88 years of service in 14 postings, across 11 stations, during for periods of significant interstellar conflict, you are the first I have encountered who appears to be preparing simultaneously for war and for what follows war. This capacity I find, in proportions I have not previously been required to calculate, both admirable and frightening. Not the preparation for war itself, which any species under sufficient existential pressure will undertake and which my records document extensively. The preparation for what comes after, The preparation requires a certainty about one's own choices about what one will do when the instrument is in hand, and the justification is complete that I have not previously observed in a species still in the process of determining whether it will survive. I write this not as a warning, because I do not have sufficient data to warn you of anything. I write it because I do not know what you intend to choose. I find, unexpectedly, that I am afraid of both possible answers. Roisin read the letter twice. With the same attentive expression she brought to census overlays and casualty projections. She set it on the desk beside the doctrine's operational files, beside the disarm codes targeting matrix on the left and the charters code sign articles on the right. The two documents that existed as separate folders in separate cases and would not be placed side by side on an actual table for another 14 months. She did not write back. She uncapped the glass nib pen. She dipped it into the inkwell, waited for the pool to settle, and returned to the evening's calligraphy. The strokes were slow, deliberate, and precisely weighted. She had been practicing the same set of characters for 12 years, not for the calligraphy itself, which she was by now technically proficient at, but for the pressure. The exact, consistent, reproducible pressure of a glass nib on paper under formal signing conditions. The kind of pressure that would not vary when the moment came, regardless of what the moment contained. Selch-Korovayan, reviewing his surveillance notes 2 weeks later, added a marginal annotation to his original entry: hand settling behavior ongoing. Duration of daily sessions unchanged despite escalating operational pressure. Assessment subject is managing via rigid routine maintenance. Fragility risk elevated. Recommend increased monitoring. He pressed his seal and filed it. He had not yet understood what he was watching. The supply paralysis began on a Tuesday. No declaration preceded it. No ultimatum transmitted through any of the standard interstellar channels the conclave monitored. No fleet positioned at the Drac VL border in the visible spectrum where their long-range sensor arrays would have logged it and flagged it and given the conclave's military council the 12 to 18 hours of advance notice they would have needed to begin a credible response. What happened instead was quieter and considerably more final nights of like orators serving the Drac VL conclave's outer military installations went silent simultaneously. At 600 station time, as though a single hand had been set, flattened, and hurried over 9 separate mouths. Selch-Korovayan recorded the event in his log 40 minutes after it was confirmed across independent monitoring channels. The entry was brief. It contained the corridor designations, the time of confirmed disruption, the projected resupply window under standard rerouting protocols, which was, his sources indicated, longer than the Drac VL Military Council had any viable answer to in one line of personal annotation, filed under OB-SCRV or an OT, rather than OFFICIL, REC or D, which in HFY practice indicated that the observation was accurate but the observer was not yet certain what it meant. This was not improvised. Tome's census maps had been precise in a way that took Selch-Korovayan 3 days of analysis to fully understand. The 9 corridors were not simply the most efficient targets from a military disruption standpoint. They were the 9 points at which military infrastructure and civilian supply chains ran closest together, without actually overlapping the exact positions where a disruption would cascade through weapons resupply and transit capacity, while leaving residential distribution networks functionally intact. To identify those 9 points required not just military mapping but civilian mapping of equal resolution. Cross-referenced, updated, and maintained in parallel for long enough that the data was current rather than historical. The exclusion zones were not an afterthought. They had been built into the targeting architecture from the beginning. Within 72 hours of the corridors going silent, the Drac VL outer fleet's 3 forward installations had begun voluntary consolidation, not retreat. Not withdrawal, but the specific logistical movement of a force that has assessed its resupply horizon and found it insufficient for sustained offensive operations. Within 6 days, the conclave's military council had convened an emergency session. Within 11, Selch-Korovayan's monitoring sources inside the conclave's administrative tier reported a conclusion that he recorded in his log with a single sentence. Filed at 315 station time, after a night he had spent reading and rereading the data. They are no longer capable of offensive action against any target requiring extended supply lines. He pressed his seal. He filed it. He sat for a long time afterward looking at the entry. Because the entry was accurate and he understood what it meant, and he did not yet know what came after it. Which was the part that mattered. Phase 2 of the doctrine was surgical, in a way Phase 1 had not been. Phase 1 had been infrastructure cold. Systemic. Invisible. The kind of operation that showed up in after-action analyses as a pattern rather than a moment. Phase to make contact. 3 engagements over 19 days. Each one scoped to a specific DRAC VL military installation that had been identified in Tome's maps as a command node rather than a supply point. Each one ending before the DRAC VL could bring reserve forces to bear. Each one demonstrating the same thing in slightly different language. The ceiling of what resistance could accomplish was lower than the floor of what was being held in reserve. The Still Hearth's operational team had spent 4 of the Doctrine's 12 years modeling the precise level of demonstrated force necessary to make the Conclave's military council understand that continued engagement had a calculable endpoint, and that endpoint had already been calculated, and the calculation had not been done by anyone who intended to stop short of it. Not a threat. A demonstration of range. 8,114 people died across those 19 days. Every name was known before the first corridor went silent. Because Tome's census maps had covered both populations and Sigrun's archives had documented both communities, and the Charter's preamble had been drafted with both counts included from the Doctrine's second year. When Roizen had made the decision that the preamble would name every casualty regardless of species, and that it would be read aloud in full at the Charter's ratification, and that the reading would take however long it took, the number was not collateral. It was a record. It was the weight the preamble was going to have to carry. And the Doctrine's core team had known that weight was coming before the first supply orator went silent. And they had built the preamble to hold it. Selshkorova N recorded the casualty figure in his log. He left 3 lines blank. He was, by this point, running out of explanations for what he was observing that fit within the frameworks his 88 years of training had given him. The conclave chamber had a smell that Selshkorova N had documented in his very first log entry from this posting, 4 years ago. As a professional courtesy to any HFY observer who might occupy this position after him, recycled coolant from the environmental systems running beneath the floor panels, and underneath that a dry mineral sharpness that large stone composite structures develop over decades of multi-species occupation, when enough different atmospheric chemistries have been breathed inside the same walls for long enough that the walls themselves begin to carry the accumulated record of everyone who has stood in them. He was in the gallery when Roizen arrived at the chamber's primary entrance. He had been there for 2 hours. He had arrived early because the HFY observer's protocol for sessions of significant diplomatic weight required advanced positioning, and because he had found, over 4 years of watching the Still Hearth's operations from a distance, that the moments immediately before Royce and Achterberg entered a room were often more informative than the moments after, in the same way that the quality of silence before a storm tells you more about the storm than the storm itself. What he observed in the 2 hours before she arrived was this: the chamber filling with species that had received no prior indication of what this session would contain. The Soth RI scholars, in their designated gallery tier, styluses in hand, the way Sothari always held their styluses when they were in a space where something might need to be written down quickly. The Korlathi were cast observers in the standing section they always occupied. Because Korlathi did not use chairs in formal settings, chairs were, in Korlathic cultural architecture, a concession to weakness, and the war cast made no concessions to weakness in public. High conclave, or the RVN Moore at the primary table, cold and still, his scales carrying the particular motionlessness of a DRAC VL who had learned to use stillness as the primary instrument of institutional authority. In front of him, a stylus. He was writing. Selshkorova N had been watching DRAC VI for 4 years. He recognized the particular quality of a DRAC VL working on a final statement, the deliberate spacing of each character, the slight forward angle of the body that indicated formal composition rather than administrative notation. The way the on-writing hand was positioned flat on the table beside the page, anchoring it without pressing. The stylus was still moving when the chamber doors opened. Then it stopped. In DRAC Vesel tradition, and Selshkorova N had writ extensively on this, because understanding what physical signals meant in the species he observed was as fundamental to his work as the documentation itself was. Top pen mid-sentence was not hesitation. It was not consideration. It was the specific and involuntary short circuit that the DRAC VL autonomic system produced when the mind encountered something it had no prepared category for. Not surprise. The deeper thing. The thing that happens when the world briefly ceases to behave according to any model the mind has been building. Roizen walked into the chamber alone. She was carrying the folders, one in each hand, held at her sides. The way a person carries things when both hands are occupied and neither item is more important than the other. Selch-Kurovian watched her cross the chamber floor. He was aware that his own stylus had stopped moving. He noted this internally and did not file it. She reached the primary table. She set the left-hand folder on the left side of the table. She set the right-hand folder on the right side. Between them, a gap of perhaps 30 centimeters, the physical distance between two documents that had been built in parallel for 12 years and had never, until this moment, occupied the same surface. "We built the weapon to end you," she said. Her voice carried in the chamber's curved acoustic architecture without effort. Not loud, the kind of projection that comes from having something to say rather than from wanting to be heard. "We also build this." A brief pause, not hesitation. "Placement. We would prefer to use this." The RVN Moore looked at the two folders for a long time. His scales shifted once the barely visible ripple under the jaw that Selch-Kurovian had spent 3 months learning to distinguish from ambient movement. The involuntary signal the Drac VL body produces when the cognitive system is processing something the emotional architecture has not yet caught up to. His non-writing hand, which had been flat on the table beside the unfinished page, came up slowly. It was shaken. Roizen set the disarm code beside the peace document and steadied his shaking hand. Nobody spoke. The Soth RA styluses were still. The Korlathi, in their standing section, had gone completely silent, and for Korlathi, complete silence was not the absence of speech. It was the maximum expression of acknowledgement available in their cultural register. The chamber held the particular quality of stillness that accumulates when a large number of beings are all simultaneously witnessing the same thing and understanding, without consulting each other, that what they are witnessing will not be repeated. Selch-Kurovian sat in the gallery with his stylus in his hand and did not write anything at all. It was the first time in 88 years of service that he had been in a room where something happened that he did not immediately know how to file. He filed the observation log entry at 240 station time, 6 hours after the chamber had cleared and 4 hours after he had returned to the HFY diplomatic suite and sat at his desk with the log open and not written anything. The suite's environmental system maintained the temperature at the standard HFY comfort setting, cool enough that the inner surface of the viewport carried a faint line of condensation along its lower edge, the kind that formed when the glass was cold and the air inside carried more warmth than it was designed to hold. Outside, the conclave's orbital ring continued its slow amber rotation. Unchanged. It had been doing this for the entirety of the session. It would continue after the log was filed and the light in Selch-Kurovian's suite went dark. Infrastructure, as he had observed before, did not know. He had spent the 4 hours reviewing his prior entries on Roizen Achterberg. All of them, chronologically, from the first notation for years ago, diplomatic actor of note, extended service classification. Behavioral indicators suggest high-stress operational load. Recommend monitoring through 17 months of marginal annotations in which variants of the phrase hand-settling behavior appeared in 9 separate entries. Through the PRIOITYWATCH flag in the assessment that she was managing fragility through rigid routine maintenance. Through the private letter he had sent through the HFY courier channel expressing concern about the stability of whatever it was she was building. She had not written back. He had filed her in unresponsens under INDRI, CADORWIDHDRAWAL, which in HFY behavioral taxonomy meant a diplomatic actor who had ceased external processing and was managing an acute situation entirely through internal resources, which was generally considered a sign of advanced stress rather than advanced capability. He reviewed that filing now and understood that he had been operating from an incomplete model. The calligraphy sessions, documented across 31 separate observations, either directly or through the Still Hearth's internal scheduling logs, which his sources had intermittent access to, daily, consistent in duration between 30 and 45 minutes, varying with operational load in the opposite direction from what fragility would predict the higher the operational pressure. The longer the session, not the shorter. He had read this as escalating displacement behavior, a coping mechanism intensifying under increasing stress, a woman holding herself together with a ritual that was becoming more necessary rather than less. He had been watching her practice her signature for 12 years. The entry he filed under FIM, LAUSS at CCs, OSHIWA NDIPLOM TI TICCTRI ROISINACH chart rear GRIN longer than any assessment. He had filed in 88 years of service. He noted this. He filed it anyway. The hand-settling behavior I documented across 31 observations was not. as I assessed, a stress regulation ritual involving the displacement of acute anxiety into controlled physical activity. It was preparation, specifically the development and maintenance of consistent pen pressure under variable emotional conditions, sufficient to execute formal signing procedures without deviation regardless of the content or consequence of what was being signed. I do not have a HFY framework for this. The closest analog in our behavioral literature is the practice maintained by HFY treaty signatories during the consolidation period of performing the sealing ritual daily in private, so that when the moment of public sealing arrived, the hand would remember what the mind might be too occupied to direct. But that practice was ceremonial. What I observed in Royce in Achterberg was functional. She was not maintaining a ritual. She was maintaining a capability. I also note, for the record, that the letter I sent expressing concern about her stability was received and read my courier confirmed delivery that she chose not to respond. I filed this non-responsence as a withdrawal indicator. I now believe it was something simpler. She had nothing to tell me that she was prepared to tell anyone outside the operational team, and she did not have time to compose a response that would be honest without being informative. The non-responsence was not withdrawal. It was appropriate operational security maintained by someone who understood exactly what she was doing and did not need my concern. The 2 documents she brought into the chamber today had been built in parallel for 12 years. The weapons targeting architecture and the peace charter's code sign articles were drawn from the same intelligence pool, by the same team, with the same level of care. I have observed many species prepare for war. I have not previously observed a species prepare equally for what comes after war, before the war has begun, without certainty that the after would arrive or that they would be present for it. I am filing a formal request to the HFY Academy's Diplomatic Studies Division to establish a new behavioral category. I do not yet have a name for what I observed. I will submit a proposed designation when I have one. He read the entry twice. He changed to words. He read it again. The preamble had been read that afternoon. In the 3 hours between the RV and Moore's signature and the Charter's formal ratification, a reading that had not been on any session schedule distributed before that morning, which meant that every species present had stayed not because protocol required it but because the chamber had developed. In the 40 minutes after Roisin set the 2 documents on the table, a quality of gravity that made departure feel like the wrong kind of choice. 8,114 names. Both sides. 7 readers. Rotating in 40-minute sections to human. To Drakvale, 1 HFY, 1 Sothari, 1 Corlithi, selected by the Charter's Code Sign Committee in its first session, which had convened 2 hours after the RV and Moore signed, with equal Drakvale representation from the first meeting. Selshkorova N had been the HFY reader. He had stood at the podium for 40 minutes and to read 212 names at the pace the tradition required full weight, each name given its own moment. Not recitation but acknowledgement. The HFY belief that a name read aloud in an official record is a name that has been received rather than simply noted. Where the section ended and he stepped back, the first Drakvale reader stepped forward. The chamber, which had been quiet throughout, became quieter in a different way, the particular quality of silence that occurs when a species is reading aloud, in a formal setting, the names of its own dead alongside the names of the species it had voted to erase. The Drakvale reader's voice did not break. But Selshkorovian, watching from 3 meters away, saw the lateral click of the second jot twice during the first 5 names, and where Belkasem's name was read in the second hour, 43rd position the Algiers cluster, by the second human reader. Selshkorovian had his log open. He wrote the name. He cross-referenced it against the DET, INIDST-USACT-IV file notation he had flagged for years ago in the peripheral intelligence suite. He wrote a single line beneath the cross-reference. He did not receive my letter. He was already detained when it was sent. He pressed his seal. He filed it. He sat for a long time with the log closed and his hand still on the desk. The Mercy Charter Council held its 3rd session 11 days after ratification. Roisin was not present. She had filed the operational handoff to the Code Sign Committee 8 days prior and returned to the Still Hearth, which was docked at a maintenance berth on the conclave's outer ring. The berth was a quiet one far enough from the primary docking complex that the ambient noise of the station's operational traffic was reduced to a low, structural hum in the hull, felt more than heard, the kind of background that disappears after 10 minutes because the ear decides it is not information. Her quarters were dark except for the viewport. The desk held the things, the glass nib pen, untapped, resting in the groove of the pen case, the position it occupied when it was not in use, when there was nothing left to record for the evening. Beside it, a cup of water that Caspian had left before he went to his bunk, still full, the surface undisturbed. He had not asked whether she wanted it. He had simply left it, the way he had learned it, over for years, to leave things she might need without attaching to whether she used them. Outside the viewport, the conclave's orbital ring moved through its slow amber arc. In the middle distance, at a position Selch-Korovian's observation logs had flagged in his morning entry as DRAKVLADMIN, ISTRATIVs SOSNONMIL, ITRIONFIG, URATION. 3 ships held station. Not weapons hot. Not in tactical formation. Present. Simply, in the way that a species learning to occupy the same orbit as another species without the grammar of threat learns first to simply be there. Without incident. Without announcement. The presence itself the statement. Roisin stood at the viewport for a long time. Her reflection in the glass was the reflection of a woman who had not slept, looking at 3 ships that 6 weeks ago had not existed in this configuration, in this orbit, under this designation. The Mercy Charter Council's 3rd session was being held without her, which was the correct outcome. The structure had been built to function without the person who built it, because a structure that required its architect to remain present had been built incorrectly. Tired, not triumphant, the pen on the desk had signed the disarm code and the peace charter 48 hours apart, in the same session, with the same ink, the same glass nib that had recorded a vote for extinction 12 years before either document had existed as anything more than an index card and a principle. It held all of that now. It did not look different. It was a pen, an ordinary object, a tool for recording things that needed to be recorded. But it had been present for both ends of the same sentence, and in HFY tradition, an instrument that had witnessed to binding acts of equivalent weight was classified as a witness subject, not merely a tool, but a record in itself. The acts that had been used to perform carried in its history the way a room carries the history of everyone who stood in it. Selch-Korovian had included this classification in his final assessment. Under a subheading he had labeled MATR-ILRECORD, which was a HFY documentary category typically reserved for objects of institutional significance. He was not certain the classification was appropriate. He had included it anyway, because the alternative was leaving it out, and leaving it out felt like an omission of something the record needed to contain. His light was still on, in the HFY diplomatic suite on the conclave's administrative tier. She could see it from the viewport, not directly, but as one amber point among the ring's many, indistinguishable from the ring's own lighting except that she knew approximately where his suite was, and the point that was his window had not gone dark. She did not know what he was writing. She did not need to know. The 3 Drac vessels held their quiet station. The orbital ring continued its slow turn. The cup of water on the desk behind her remained undisturbed, its surface flat, reflecting the viewport's amber light in a long, thin line that moved slightly as the ring moved, and then steadied, and held. The pen rested in its groove. The window stayed dark outside, and then the ring turned, and the amber came back, and outside in the long, ordinary silence of a changed orbit, the 3 ships were still there.